Daniel with us, who is going to be going through a new product for Green Tech, which is the Woodland Grow. A really exciting product that we think is just going to kick off this season and forevermore. So I'll leave it with Daniel and we can get going. And if you've got any questions, if you just type them in your little chat box at the bottom there, and then once Daniel's done his presentation, we'll be able to go through the questions and answer them as best we can. So feel free to take over, Daniel, and we're all good.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for joining me today and probably missing out on your lunch or eating your lunch now. So appreciate your time. This is a presentation that kind of brings together 5 years of work from us in terms of trying to work out how to bring a woodland soil microbiome into the tree nursery, as well as how do you help trees then transition from nursery through to planting in their final place, whether that's landscaping or woodland creation. And it's a project that's been funded by the Forestry Commission for the last 3.5 years under the Tree Production Innovation Fund, and this is the commercial spin out for it. Aptly named Woodland Grow. The presentation takes about half an hour, so with questions at the end, it probably takes about 45 minutes. So we'll try and work through the questions at the end, and I'll cover the presentation as we go. So in principle, what we're here to talk about is how do you feed a tree without using synthetic soluble man-made fertiliser, and how does a tree also access its nutrients? And what it comes down to is that relationship between a plant and the microbes, that's the fungi and the bacteria, for them to be able to do their nutrient exchange and get food from what is normally an abundant amount of nutrition that's in the soil, but it's in organic form. And without the microbes, the trees can't access it, which is why we often see trees that are suffering from being under pressure, whether that be from a bit of extra heat in the spring or the organic matter around the soil. It's all about the microbes and how the tree accesses its nutrition and the plants. And the premise of the project is how do you, after you've managed a woodland, take that material to recreate the microbiome to then plant and manage more trees. So the fungi and the bacteria are effectively there from day one for the trees and or when you transition them from the nursery. Because most trees in the UK are grown with synthetic fertiliser, and that is a plant available soluble nutrition, the N as the NPK goes, and that is then just taken up by the plant without having to give up any sugars or any enzymes for doing it. So that nutrient exchange doesn't exist when you're using synthetic fertiliser. So how do you build that up and using the existing material? So it's one of zero carbon, zero waste, but also about what does the plant want? How do you get the nutrition, the microbes to the trees, the plants, the landscape, when you've grown them with synthetics. And for us, that we're using bark fines as our bulk ingredient. It's a residue that's been left after the sawmill have finished with the trees, and the brush and all the bits and pieces have been dealt with, whether it's your mulch, whether it's your particle boards. There's residues that are left over, and in this apt picture you can see the backdrop of the logs, and then the bark fines are in the foreground, and that's what we're using as our baseline. Fine, so we're now talking about the succession line of soil, where you have bacteria on the weed end and you've got fungi at the tree end. But fundamentally, you have bacteria and fungi all the way through that soil succession, whether it's growing crops or otherwise. You always need fungi and different types of fungi for organic matter to be broken down, and also doing the nutrient exchange with the plants. And what you tend to find is the ratio becomes 1-to-1, where you get to the crop position and the ericaceous plants. So on the bacteria side, way more bacteria than fungi, and then on the tree side, way more fungi. And I think the thing that we started on with this project was, how do you create a fungal dominated microbiome to be able to feed the trees, so that when they leave the nursery and get planted, they've got their microbiome with them. Because if you're planting trees into an agricultural setting, you'll often find that there isn't enough fungi there from modern farming practices, whether that's fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, or ploughing, or the use of synthetic fertiliser where they don't have a function. If you're planting trees in agricultural land, the chances are that there isn't enough fungi there for them, which is why people are starting to see bigger and bigger losses as they're planting projects, because there's less and less fungi in the degraded lands that we're choosing. I think if you're doing a planting in a site that's just been clear felled and you're doing a hot planting, I think that's good, because you've got the existing mycorrhizal fungal network that's there. It needs a carbon source to be alive and to stay there. But if you're leaving a clear fell for 5 years for pests reasons, what you'll find is that community and that fungal network isn't what it was, and therefore you've got to work out how to build that fungal network up for the next generation. Sorry, my screen has gone a bit funny. Let me just see where I am. Right, sorry. Right, slide 4, hopefully. So once we've got the fungi and the bacteria, one of the other things that we need is the nutrient cyclers. You need the amoeba, the protozoa, the nematodes. And effectively, this is a succession line of the microbes, that the bacteria get eaten by the protozoa get eaten by the nematodes, and then the nematodes have a poo. And that poo is an enzyme, is what is plant available. And that's what the plant takes. So the synthetic fertiliser version is effectively replicating and taking away that process and just giving the plant exactly what it needs. But in doing that, the plant doesn't do a nutrient exchange and work with the microbiome. Therefore, it's kind of why it is not sustainable, and it only lasts for as much as fertiliser as you put down and as much as it rains. Because if it's soluble, it just goes down the river, which is why we're seeing eutrophication in various parts of the UK's water systems. So by using natural sources of nutrition that are in organic form, that are then broken down by the microbes to then make them plant available, you don't have a problem with water quality, you don't have a problem with leaching, you don't have a problem with nutrient runoff. And this is because we're trying to replicate the natural cycling system of the soils. So what we've effectively done is worked out how to breed that microbiome and then recreate it, so that we can then associate that with growing of the trees and then the transition of the trees. So in this video, you can, or within this picture, you can see the nematode worm, you can see the fungal hyphae, you can see the bacteria, and the complexity of life, which is how we view the world when you look at it under a microscope. So if you take a pinch of soil, doesn't need to be a lot, you put it under the microscope and it just comes to life. It's not too exciting for a presentation, but if you ever do get the opportunity, please do. And again, the more you look and what does healthy look like, it is all the actors in there, which is, again, lots of fungi, bacteria, protozoa, amoebae, and the nematodes. And if you have that, you have a self-regulating cycle where everybody, so the bacteria proliferate, that's fine, they get eaten by the protozoa get eaten by the nematode. And that is how you feed a tree in the natural world. And what we're talking about here is we've created a fertiliser that is effectively the system of a woodland soil. So the complexity and the richness that you get with all the different fungal species, bacteria, because they all have a different function and a different role. So from from our perspective and how we achieve that is we create a mother, and that mother is from different organic source materials from agriculture and forestry. We leave that for a period of 12 months, so the complexity improves, the abundance improves, the richness, the diversity of the species that are in there. But ultimately, what you end up with is a living system that is that's able to work together in harmony as a natural system does, so that you can then use that in planting projects, landscaping, and the like. So in here, the bit that I always find fascinating is that there's about 400 or 500 species of fungi in the soil, but actually it's only one that ever comes to the surface and then kind of dominates that scene. And each one of our bags that we're proliferating the microbiome in has a different fungi species that come to the top and then spread around. So for us, it's really important to recognise that a lot of fungi is good, but it's not all the ones that come up to the top and fruit. It's actually the community that's under the soil that's actually really, really important, not the one or two that you can see in the landscape. So as part of the Tree Production Innovation Fund, we've grown lots of trees in lots of different settings. We've been working with Alba trees, we've been working with Forestry England. We've got a tree nursery in our woodland in Pembrokeshire, where we've done a lot of research and development. And for 2 years, we've been doing growing trials. And for 3 years, we've been doing the microbiome development. And what we've been able to show is that you can grow trees in the Ellapot paper pot system using the mother, the nutrition, and the bark fines to grow trees without synthetic fertiliser. So the trees are doing a natural cycling with the fungi and the nutrition that we apply to it, which are agricultural residues, forestry residues, and fishery residues, with some minerals in there to give the micro and trace elements like sulphur, the boron, the molybdenum, irons and zincs. So it's not just NPK. There's 20 odd nutrition elements that we need to think about. But if you get the NPK ratios and abundances right, and then the micro and trace elements, that the tree is able to grow, and especially when you can then make it where it's doing a nutrient cycling with it. We just go and find the next picture. So we've done a lot of growing on different species, and I think for 2 consecutive years we've grown about 100,000 trees on each year. And within that, what we do tend to find is that the tree is able to be healthier and grow better than the one compared with synthetic fertiliser and the current peat-free mixes. And that just comes down to, NPK is a finite source. The plant takes it, it grows really quickly, it's really green, it's really sweet, and we get a big plant. But at the same token, it's susceptible to pests and diseases. The cell walls are relatively thin, and it doesn't have much of an armour from the fungi and bacteria that is typically in the soil and on the seed from its microbiome perspective, because it's not needed to do that natural exchange with it. So therefore, oaks are typically suffering from mildew, and hazels would perhaps typically suffer from aphids. And in our growing trials, we had neither on the ones grown in living soil. Now, the world of fungi and microbes is really, really complicated. The Innovation Fund was about how do you do it and if you can do it, as opposed to what was the nuance that made it work. So for us, we think there's 3 pieces here. One is the physical element of having enough organic matter and the ability for it to cycle and proliferate within the microbial community, to proliferate within the pot. We think that there's the community of fungi and bacteria on the leaves, so therefore there's armour on the leaves. And I think the other aspect is it's not just a synthetic NPK. You get in the enzymes and the natural sources of nutrition like silica and the zincs and the borons that actually add to the cell wall structure and the walls of the lining, and it just changes the way in which a tree is susceptible. So in this picture you'll see a set of trees grown with synthetic fertiliser covered in mildew, and they're on the same nursery, in the same area, in the same polytunnels for the ones that have been grown now for 2 consecutive years. So it's not just a one-off, no mildew whatsoever. So a plant's ability to grow naturally and sustainably and healthily is totally possible through using the fungi, bacteria, and natural sources of nutrition. And that is what we're trying to achieve in terms of when we're creating these environments. We don't want to influence with synthetic fertiliser, because if we influence with synthetic fertiliser, it delays the point at which the plant actually then does nutrient exchange with the existing microbes. So if you're planting trees, if you're planting a landscape up and you're currently buying synthetic fertiliser, yes, you get a bigger plant for it because you've applied fertiliser, but what you've actually done is robbed the plant of that time to create a symbiotic relationship with nature and the microbes. And I think the reason why we apply synthetic fertiliser typically is to give the tree or the plant a helping hand to be able to sustain the period from when it's been in nursery to when it's been in the landscape. And that might be because the landscape doesn't have any or much fungi in the soils. So this is the gap we're trying to, the nature gap we're trying to build here, is by creating our grow media and our fertiliser pellets, you're able to inoculate the soils with fungi, bacteria, nematodes, and the natural sources of nutrition from forestry, agriculture, and fisheries that you would typically find and want as a well-balanced profile. So if it's new planting or new landscaping, if you start looking at the world through the life of a fungi, what you want to do is improve the chances of the fungal biomass to increase, which then improves the prospect for the plant. I know you're here to talk about our fertiliser within the concept of forestry and landscaping, but I think one of the things that we find fascinating is it's the same recipe for trees as it is for lettuce. So in this example, we were growing lettuce in the Elipot paper pot system to then go out and transition to fields. And again, it's the same principle of you're growing something in a nursery and you want it to go out in the field, and you want them to have the same language, so they're all talking to each other at the same time. So by having a certain amount of the nutrition that is soluble and available to the plant, and then it is mineralized by the microbes, you can pretty much grow anything, because the concept and what I'm talking about here is one of ecology and one of soil, and it almost becomes universal from that succession line from pioneer weeds through to trees. What changes is the complexity of the microbes and the abundance of the fungi. So another example of what we've done is we've done some ornamental primroses, we've done some scabious devil's bit on the right, and in that example, Woodland Grow is on the top and a commercially available peat-free growing media is underneath. And actually what happened is, from seedlings through to retransplanting, the Woodland Grow batch went a little bit yellow, and that's because they were running out of the synthetic fertiliser from the transplanting, and then they had to start working out naturally how to interact with the microbes. And then over the successive weeks and months that went on with this growing trial, the Woodland Grow plants ended up with more vigorous roots, better root structure, there were bigger plants, better colour. And this is because synthetic fertiliser is just a finite resource. It's not a living system. It's not able to sustain the life. And this is why we have a nature gap. It's not that we don't have the understanding. It's just until we did this project, there wasn't a way to be able to recreate and sustainably recreate a living microbial system to be able to create this fertiliser. But by using the Forestry Commission work, we're able to mimic woodland soils and then help trees either through growing them or transplanting them with our fertiliser. So one of the other things that makes this project relevant and interesting for people out there that do land management is also from a farming perspective, that people are used to and have typically used synthetic fertiliser to grow crops. And so we did a growing trial in this tram line just using fungi, natural sources of nutrition, and bark fines. And in doing so, we were able to reduce the carbon footprint for the farmer by 95% compared to the synthetic fertiliser. So I think synthetic fertiliser is something like for every 1 tonne is 5 tonnes of CO2. And then for us, it's about 120 kilos. So it's a real big number difference. And actually, what they were able to do was switch off synthetic fertiliser on day one and grow a crop using just fungi and microbes. And actually, when they've gone back to do growing on top of it without putting in much more on, the rapeseed crop is actually doing far better than the other side where they use synthetic fertiliser, mainly because every time it rains, with synthetic fertiliser being so soluble, it goes down the river. So again, doesn't matter if it's forestry, landscaping or agriculture, soluble synthetic fertiliser will only stay for as long as it is not raining and not running down the river. And I think that is a real big difference for us. It's natural sources of nutrition, it's the CO2 perspective, but it's also the water quality that you get from the end of it. You don't have a water quality problem if you're using organic sources of nutrition. It can't be soluble and going down the river if the microbes haven't processed it yet. And microbes are processing it and doing nutrient exchange with the plants as and when they need. So neither gives up enzymes and sugars without needing to. So what does this look like when we do analysis from a DNA perspective? So what we did here was we did, in the early days, we were looking at different feedstocks as different compost to see if one feedstock was better for a species like conifer versus broadleaf or oaks versus cherry. And for us, I think we've changed our narrative there, and the more diverse the microbiome is, the better it is, as opposed to trying to hone it down for species. I think that might be a little too early, but that was the concept of what we were doing and why we have these. So we've got compost 1, compost 2, compost 3 in the chart on the left, and then we've got bark fines as the base ingredient, and then the growing media, commercially available, forestry type. And when you do look at the DNA analysis, our microbiome, doesn't matter which one it was we created, was richer and more diverse and more abundant in the fungi and the bacteria. And I think that's a big distinction to make, is I think we're one of the only companies that are actually determining and wanting and measuring the fungi and bacteria that is in our grow media. Whereas for everybody else, they follow a process, it's there for so much time, and they use typically urea to be able to accelerate the composting process, which then effectively creates a bacteria party, makes it too hot, and then the fungi don't like that and then they die off. So most composts and most grow medias don't actually have much, if any, fungi in them. And if you do, you tend to find that they're the ones that you don't want in this cycle. So I think the other point that I like from this slide is that I think this is the DNA analysis. So 16S is bacteria, ITS is the fungi, and one is a before, which is at the top, and then below it is after. And I think we're starting to get familiar and talk about how a seed has a microbiome, and it's passed down by generation to generation of trees, so that when it gets that microbiome and it gets scattered in the wind, it's got its best fighting chance of surviving by having what effectively is its immune system and ability to navigate and talk to them and get microbes to give it the nutrition that it needs. So when we think about extending a tree canopy, or you've got a triple SI that you're trying to be sensitive to, seed collection, provenance, where you get it, how you store it, how do you maintain that coating of microbes on a seed is massively important. But equally, what you grow it in to maintain that is also important. So I think the thing for me is a couple of points here is that the 300 and odd species that we have identified is only 24% of that fungal community that we've got. And that's because the rest of it is unknown to science. So when you work with nature, there is a lot of there's a lot of benefits, but equally science hasn't really caught up. And I think we're at about 6% of the fungal population that's been identified. So Kew Gardens did a report last year, I think it was, where it was 2.5 million fungal species that we think there are in the world, and we've identified 110,000 of them to date. And typically in a year, we identify 2,500 fungal species per year. So my math says to be able to understand the amount of fungi we have in this world is going to take us another 1,000 years. So being able to work with nature is very, very important, as opposed to using synthetics. And we have to get comfortable with using big handfuls of saprotrophic fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, which type of mycorrhizal fungi it is, what functions they have, whether there's overlaps and redundancies with the jobs that they do. And that's also typical of the nutrition as well. So we have a before position and an after position. And what you'll see is that the community improves over time. Now, for us, that's a symptom of the environment. There's fungi and bacteria in the air, but it's also a function of that seed interacting with that microbial community that was already in the grow media and what that meant for how it was growing. So then the last slide, which includes a bit of a picture of the product that we're here to talk about, which is the natural fertiliser. And I've kind of kept the product to the end because what we're here to talk about really is letting people know that there is another way to grow plants and trees. It doesn't have to be synthetic and man-made, imported. It can be UK-based, UK materials, UK manufacturing. So there's a lot of native microbes here. It's natural sources of nutrition that are residues, and therefore you get the organic minerals and nutrition. You get the microbes that know how to break them down, and you get the way in which it talks to the seeds and the plants becomes relevant. So I've not really pushed the product, but there's a picture of what the pellets look like, and it's effectively mother bark fines nutrition pelleted up, allowing you to either inoculate the soils as planting, whether you've bought some topsoil and trying to create a landscaping position, you can inoculate that. It could be that you've bought some mulch and you want to add some life to the mulch, then you add the pellets. So the pellets for us is this universal inoculant method to be able to put life into your landscape and your planting projects. And in doing that, you're giving the plant the best chance to be able to have the health and resilience and the growth without having to rely on a soluble synthetic fertiliser that when it rains, it's just going to disappear down the river. So the other part of the DNA analysis here is that you've got the commercially available grow media, you've got the bark fines, and then you've got compost 1, 2, and 3. And this was an output from growing our oaks. It was all in the same nursery, all grown using different substrates. And then we did a DNA analysis and had a look at the core microbiome. And this is what this was. Now, within that core microbiome, across all of those different substrates and different feedstocks, the trees were talking to the same 4 fungi and 30 bacteria. And I think that's really important to kind of recognise and think about, that the plant is the one that knows what it wants. Now, it will change during the season. It will change whether it's under attack from mildew, for example, where there's a biological response. It will change on its growth rates and where it is and how much nutrition it needs. And I think the thing that I find fascinating is on the far right-hand side, out of the 4 replicates, there was one tree working with 100% unknown fungi. So we don't prescribe particular and explicit fungal types. We work with a smorgasbord of microbes and nutrition, and we effectively say this is what would happen in nature and this is how it would help itself. It does the selecting. So for us, this doesn't matter if it's a lettuce or an ericaceous plant in a landscape or a tree. It doesn't matter if it's a sapling that's 1 year old or 5 years old or 100 years old. All trees need fungi, bacteria, and natural sources of nutrition. So if you've got a specimen tree that's 100 years old and it's starting to suffer, maybe from it's running out of nutrition, maybe its community of microbes aren't as healthy as they should be, or there could be something like root-feeding nematodes that are in the soil that we need to actually address. And the way to think about that is abundance, diversity, and richness are all ways to help and nudge nature and give the plant what it needs as it's growing. So for us, I do hope that you've, and in the future, consider the use of Woodland Grow fertiliser. it's a natural way of being able to feed the plants. It's a low carbon opportunity, whether that's from a business perspective or an environmental perspective. It's definitely a metric that's getting measured a lot now. And I think also from a water quality point of view, and the cost of going back to a tree that suffered from pests and diseases from either not enough fungi or only able to grow off the back of synthetic fertiliser. So for me, that's our presentation. I'll just try and scroll over to some of the questions and answer some of those. Fine, so the first question is, so interested to hear if Woodland Grow can be used in young woodlands to inoculate soils to improve tree success. Has this been trialled? How is it applied? And what rate per tree is needed? That's a really good question. And for us, it has been trialled. We've done the growing trial. So let me take a step back. So the pellets that we've created and the growing media that we've got for backfilling, which is on Green Tech's website, is essentially everything that we've done to grow our trees, but we've just compressed it or put it in a bag to suit. So what you're getting is the growing media that we've grown trees in that has the fungi, the bacteria, the nutrition, and the bark fines, which is the organic matter, to be able to help that tree transition. So from a trials perspective, we planted both trees earlier this year, and we've been monitoring them growing. And then we've also been doing pellets where we've been applying those to soils, and also from agriculture where we've been monitoring those. So for us, we've got a lot of data that says if you use our product, you can inoculate the soil, and the soil will then become healthy and start self-regulating itself far quicker than if you did nothing. So the example I got last night was we applied some fertiliser in February, and there was no fungi in the soils, and it was a tree planting project where the trees were suffering and not perhaps growing as much, and they trialled our product. And then from February to now, the fungal community is there and high enough for the plants to do nutrient cycling. So we don't typically see high enough numbers for nutrient cycling until about year 10 with a tree, because every year it gives up more sugars and every year it attracts more fungi and bacteria to its roots. And that is a population that kind of increases over year on year on year. So if you're starting in an agricultural setting, you're just going to have to assume that the fungi is at 0 or below the threshold for measurement, because farming just does not account for fungi. It's using synthetic fertiliser, fungicides and pesticides. So if you want to do microscopy, that is a service that we do. And we can measure your soils to see how alive they are, but I think it's safe to assume from all the analysis we've done that there's no fungi in the soil. So if you want fungi in the soils, you can use our fertiliser and it will inoculate, and over that 12-month period you're building up the food for the microbes, as well as you've inoculated with the microbes that are already there, and you've given the plant the nutrition. The bags we've been doing is, so there's different scenarios for different people, so if you're doing a restoration site on a quarry, for example, or a highway, we've got a lot of clay, I think you have to assume that there's very, very, very little, and it really is 0 fungi. So we've got a product called Pro, so Woodland Grow Pellets Pro. If you're planting in a field that you think has got some fungi in, but probably not because it's ex-agricultural, we've got Standard. And then there's a new one we're going to launch now, which is Contractor, and that might be for restock, or you're just planting 1 million trees, and therefore the stocking allows you to just put a bit less in. So for the Standard, we're saying it's 1,000 trees for the 20 kilos that is in there. So it's a few pellets for every time you plant a tree, and it's not a case where you can overdose it. So if you've got a 1 metre tall tree, put a handful in. If you've got 1.5 meters and you've got a pit and you want to backfill, then scatter some in. You can't overdose with natural organic source of nutrition, because it's got to be mineralized by the microbes. Fine, so there's another question. How do the sensitive fungi cope with heating drying to make pellets, and do the pellets need to be buried, as presumably they don't like sunlight? This, again, good questions. No, thank you. There's a couple of points there. So If you're planting a tree, you're literally making a hole, then you're going to put the fertiliser in the hole and you're going to put the tree in. I think that's the right thing to do as you're doing it. I think when it comes to trees that are 1 to 100 years old, it's totally fine to spread on the top. They don't necessarily like or dislike sunlight, but if you're planting at this time of year, it tends to be wet, whether that's mildew in the morning, from rain, or otherwise. So what we see is that whether it's in agriculture or forestry or landscaping, if it's on the top surface, on the grass or on the bare soil, what happens is it breaks down, goes into the soil, and the plants do the talking. It's a bit anecdotal what I'm going to say to you, but we did some living soil in my woodland to collect some worms as part of our process. We wanted some native worms, and we put some living soil, put a hessian sack on, and we did the same with some silage and some straws. And in the silage and straws, the only thing that we found was voles and mice. That's fine. But what we actually found in the living soil was the trees had actually come up and started interacting with the compost through the underneath the hessian sack, and it was fruit and fungi all over the place. So the trees know where to come and find where their food is. So if, for example, you're doing a planting and you're thinking about a mulch mat, then you could mix the pellets in with the mulch, and then you're putting it on the surface, and it will just proliferate and be in there with the oxygen and the moisture, and then it will just go down into the soil. I'm certainly not worried anymore about putting it on the surface, and as long as it's not in the baking hot June. And so weather like this now, I think it's absolutely ideal. Fungi are sensitive. They absolutely are sensitive. But what we're doing is, when we're making this, it's a relatively free-flowing material, the bark fines. And yes, we will lose some on the outside of the pellet, but it is not steamed, it's not heat treated, it's as natural as we can get, effectively putting material through a mincer or a feed mill, which is what it is. And there's a bit of pressure on the outside. So yes, we'll lose on the outside. That's why we do an 8mm die. But what you find is that the bit in the middle is just teeming with life. So yes, we lose a bit, but it just doesn't matter. And I think the analogy is, for a cubic centimetre of soil, you end up with billions of life in that. So for the fertiliser pellets, there is a lot of life in there. There's a lot of nutrition in there, and I don't know a different way of doing it as efficiently as that. So what quantity is required per square metre, plus a few trial trees grown in planters? So yes, we've definitely grown trees in planters, as in like a closed system. And I think the closed system is really interesting because you've got to think about how that isn't replicated by soil. We have all your different minerals in there. So a planter has to have everything in it. And that's why we've got our NPK, macro and trace elements, and everything's in it. And also why it's cycling. So for me, if it was all our material in a planter, then I'm not worried or concerned. You can water it all day long. It's a natural living cycling system and almost doesn't have like an end date on it. It's not something that runs out. One of the things that we have in there is hoof and horn as an example, and that's a really good slow release fertiliser that is then taken on over time. So for a square metre, if you're, and again, I'm not going to help you by giving you this information probably, but I'm trying to be helpful by giving you the freedom to make this judgment, is if you're in poor soils and you've got ericaceous plants, you're going to need more. But if you're in really good soils and you've got a primrose, then you probably need a bit less. So you have to come back to what is that succession line and where you're at. So if you're in really good soil and you're trying to give it a boost, then it's less. But if you're in poor soil and it's a tree, you're going to have to give it more. So for us, the quantities we've been given and what are on the data sheets are an average. I'm happy to take calls if you have phone numbers on the system. If you want to give us a call and talk about your particular scenario. So I had a call this week where somebody was doing a restoration and it was 1.5 metre tall trees. What was the best quantity? And I think for this is about working with the client to understand what is the budget and what you're trying to achieve. So on the basis that you're not going to overdose it and you're trying to get a really healthy tree growing really, really quickly, then, and you can afford it, you'd put slightly more on. if you're on a contract and a price and you're trying to do the best that you can, then you're still better by using it than not at all. And I think these are the things that we try and help you navigate by putting the list. So I think it's the 50-litre compost bag was for a cubic metre for a backfill, but equally could be for a couple of square metres as you're planting. But again, it would depend on the species type and what you're trying to achieve. I'm going to be brave here and say that the Green Tech team have been trained. They're fairly aware of what we're doing. So if they can't answer your question, they can either email me and I'll get the answer to you. Right. There's another question. With existing planting, do you have to dig in and to what depth? So that's a really good question. So when we do a microscopy, it's really from the first 3 inches, and the deeper you go, the more pressure there is, and the microbes change from aerobic to anaerobic and the way in which they function. So if you're planting a tree and you're putting it in, you follow the same process and just put it in. But if you were doing a Miyawaki, perhaps, I'd only go a foot deep to be able to just loosen up the soil. But there's one thing with nature that I think we often forget about, and that is the beauty of time. So the more time you have, then the more it will work with nature. So for us, if you were planting next year and you were thinking about what to do, I'd be applying our fertiliser this year, knowing that you had 12 months ahead of you for the microbes to proliferate and breed within their environment. And it's the same thing with, if you've got dormancy and you're planting now versus planting in April, you might put slightly more in April and slightly less now because you've got that benefit of time. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers that question. Does it have a sell-by date? I'm hesitating, and I'm just going to try and work out what to say. So for us, I don't believe there's a sell-by date because the system is cycling. But what we're really keen on making sure is that when you get this product, it is going to work, and we've got the data to be able to support you if there is an issue or we're trying to work out anything. So when we're making it, we give a shelf life, and it's a few months. And I think for you to use it, there's probably a couple of months after that. There is not if you get it, you must use it by day dot. We made some material in June, and I used it the other week, and it was still fine. So for us, there's like a dormancy, and the moisture level within the pellets is keeping that microbiome alive. And therefore, what you're also getting is that nutrition. So nutrition doesn't go off. The microbiome, the spores, all of those things are what creates this product. And I think there is a lot of mycorrhizal fungi in here, but because nature is really complex, I don't want to say that we have 20 mycorrhizal species in there. We're saying it's a broad church and there's a lot in there. It's not that we don't know what it is. We just don't want to say that it's going to grow 10 times quicker than the next one. It will by virtue of you using fungi, but we don't want to make a claim that doesn't make sense, because nature just doesn't work like that. You have to work with nature, and that's what we're doing. So it's not a silver bullet. It is just, this is how nature works. So you've got a choice really: synthetic fertiliser, which doesn't work with nature, and natural fertiliser, which works with nature. And I think it's as simple as that. So there's another question which says, are you interested in trial sites to compare success of planting with Woodland Grow versus no fertiliser on woodland success? I think the short answer is yes, but there is a lot already going on, and there's a lot of money that's been spent. So I just, if you want to talk about trials and how it works, I think we can do. I think we have a lot of data already, and what I wouldn't want to do is replicate data. From a pricing perspective, we've put this fertiliser certainly a lot cheaper than fungi spores that you can purchase, and it's probably comparable, maybe a bit more than synthetic fertiliser. And that's because it comes with a label that's NPK. It's not a bag of voodoo. It's organic matter, it's microbes, and it's nutrition. And what you get is nutrition. And every day of the week it's nutrition, and every day of the week it's that bark fines and the organic matter. And that's what plants need because they've created it. So that is it. So if you want to get in touch and talk about trial sites, I'm happy to have the conversation. But after 3.5 years of doing analysis, DNA, microscopy, nutrition analysis, I think there is a position where we're happy, comfortable that what we are promoting, selling is both justified and is working. And we've got multiple results from Cornwall through to Scotland, Wales through to Norfolk. So it's not just one site, one trial, it's hundreds of thousands of trees, it's thousands of trees all over different parts of the country where they're all showing that there has been a benefit to either surviving or the soil health. And I think if you were to compare synthetic fertiliser to the metrics we care about, you wouldn't use synthetic fertiliser. So it's a bit of a, to me, it's the wrong question, because one is a cheat and one is natural. So if we're comparing nature against nature, that's totally fine. But I think it's almost perverse to be comparing synthetic fertiliser to grow fertiliser, because it's two different things. It's like growing a kid, or raising a kid on healthy butties or Mars bars all day every day. The two can't be compared because one's bad and not normal, right? So yeah, it's not a get out. It's just that's how I see the world. Let me just see if I've right. So if there's any more questions to come through, I'm happy to answer. But if not, I think that was the 45 minutes that I promised you, and you can get your lunchtime back.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Daniel. It was really good to hear, and hope it was informative for everyone. I think we have just had a couple more questions, so if you're okay to answer those, and then we can end it there, and like you say, let everyone go and have their lunch. So
yeah, no, great question. Can it be used in combination with synthetic fertiliser? I'll tell you what I think, and then I'll let you, it's for you to make up a decision. So a tree or a plant has two choices when it's got synthetic fertiliser and ours. So in the natural world, a plant has to give up the sugars via the root exudate to do a nutrient exchange to get the enzymes with the microbes, and it takes it. That is a cost to the plant. And then if you've got synthetic fertiliser, it just takes it and it's free. So if a plant's got a choice between free food or giving up a sugar and doing a nutrient exchange, it's going to choose the free food. And what you want the plant to do is do a nutrient exchange, because as soon as the synthetic fertilisers run out, it stops growing and it's even bigger, and it hasn't got the support network, the microbes to feed it. So to me, I'd always go down the using ours exclusively. Now, the other thing to think about is synthetic fertiliser is salt-based, and salts kill the microbes. So it's really perverse. Even if you did have microbes, you end up killing them by using synthetic fertiliser, because it actually robs function as well as creates an environment that's not suitable for them. So for us, it's cold turkey. You have to go down the natural fertiliser on its own 100%. And I think having done this in agriculture, got a crop, grown food, that should be evidence enough that you can go cold turkey. You don't need the crutch of a synthetic fertiliser. Because the more you give fertiliser from synthetic, the bigger the problem you have. And I've certainly seen and heard planting schemes where they lose 10% of their trees having given synthetic fertiliser. And for me, the reason for that would be that the microbiome isn't big enough to support them. So the bigger the tree, the more microbiome. And the longer you use synthetic fertiliser, the smaller the microbiome is, because the tree isn't giving up its sugars. Right, so if you're applying, I don't know if that answers, but that's my view. So if you're applying fertiliser to the trees, does this mean that you're also applying fertiliser to the grass and other weed species? What happens then when we use herbicides? Fine, so there's two questions there. So the first one is, because we're fungal dominated and less bacteria, yes, you are feeding everything, but the nutrition that we are providing is complex nutrition. And what I mean by that is, if it's simple nutrition, bacteria like it, we're into the pioneer weeds. Complex nutrition, it goes into the fungi, goes into the tree. So yes, you're going to feed everything, but so does synthetic fertiliser that's plant available, and that's why you have a weed problem with synthetic fertiliser. So for us, we've made it that the more complex the nutrition is, the easier it is for the tree to get it and outcompete the weeds. But that's not me saying if you plant trees without fertiliser, you don't have a weed problem. I think the two are totally different things. You have to do a microscopy on the soil, work out how much bacteria is there, and that will tell you whether you've got a weed problem. It's not the weeds really, it's the microbes. So the more fertiliser you can use that is complex, that is not plant available, the more you're going to be an advantage to the tree. So that's kind of the first point there. And what happens when you use herbicides? Now, Roundup is glyphosate. Glyphosate is toxic to arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and it's also a chelator. So what it does is it does a bit of a wrapper around the nutrition. That means it's never available to plants ever again, and it kills the fungi. So to us, Roundup, glyphosate is absolutely the worst thing you can do for trying to establish a woodland, because you're killing the one thing that you need, which is the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Now, I know why people use it. They want to just knock the grass back so they can plant a tree and the tree gets away, and people will think about the narrative of competing for nutrition. But it's not that. It's too much bacteria, too much simple food. So if you want to not use Roundup and benefit the tree, use natural source of nutrition that are complex. Now, what does that mean for herbicides, so curb? I've not done a trial to know exactly, but if you just think about what you're trying to do in the lens of fungi and bacteria, if you've got a weed problem, you've got too much bacteria, yeah. And if you're trying to grow a tree, you need fungi. So actually, the tools of the trade that you've got are not the tools of the trade that you need. You want to be able to put complex food in for the tree to be able to outcompete the weeds, because you're giving it the fungi and the food that it knows how to talk to. So yes, sorry. Couldn't read the graphs, it's a small screen. Would it be possible to share? Yes. I don't know if you want to send me an email and I'll try and do it, but it's the reason why I don't typically share them is because there's a lot of money being spent at Ferra on DNA analysis. There's a lot of data, and the context kind of becomes lost sometimes. But if you want to arrange a session with me one-on-one, I'm happy to share more data and go through it. But it is relatively complicated. Not that it's impossible. It's just I'm just trying to give a snapshot in these presentations. When is it going to go back in stock? As far as I'm aware, Green Tech have stock of the Pro and the standard pellets and the growing, like the compost for backfilling. So there shouldn't be a stock issue there. Yeah, the conversation about herbicide use is it's interesting and fascinating. I think landscape, foresters, horticulture, we deal with outcomes, not the root cause. So the outcome is too much weed, and therefore we deal with the weed. But in dealing with the weed, with the products and tools we have, we end up with this cycle of proliferating the wrong thing, which is bacteria in simple food. So if you can be brave enough, it would be to try and nudge the soils over. Because what you're essentially saying is you're taking a field that grows grass, which is the total opposite end to the place that you want, which is trees, which is complex microbiome. And that's why we have this nature gap, and that's why this product exists, because the Forestry Commission could see that and they wanted to influence that, which is why they funded us for such a long period of time. I hope that has helped answer some of those questions.
Yeah, so that's great. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to everyone for those questions. In the meantime, if anyone after this does think of any more questions, feel free to ring your rep at Green Tech. And if it does need to go to Daniel, like Daniel said before, we can send the question over to Daniel and get your replies from that. So, and thank you to everyone who has joined, and I hope everyone found it informative. And then, yeah, and I also can confirm that we do have stock at the moment as well. So I'd just like to say thank you to Daniel, and then thank you to everyone for joining, and I hope you all have a nice day.
Thank you.